Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining this digital health panel for our RESI conference. I am very happy to introduce our wonderful panel lineup. I will introduce our moderator and he will introduce the rest of the panel. So with pleasure, I will let Amit take it away.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Life Science Nations team. You guys organize fantastic events. I was a panelist last year. I must have not done terrible enough job for you guys to invite me this year to be a moderator. So appreciate it. And thank you to all the folks listening in. I don't know who you are, but you're probably pretty good folks. I think half of you are investors. That's what Life Science Nation tells us. And that's why we will try to make this panel a little bit more in depth. Obviously, still focus on entrepreneurs, but keeping in mind that we have some folks with a lot of knowledge about startups and VCs. And my goal is to make sure that there's at least one fight during this panel. So we are going to ask good questions here, not just the usual, everybody agreeing with everyone. We'll try to ask in-depth questions. Let me introduce myself quickly. So Tau Ventures is a seed-focused fund in Silicon Valley. We do applied AI in 3 verticals: digital health, enterprise, automation, meaning cars, drones, robots. We invest in US and Canada, but we are very friendly towards teams that might be located partially outside. So if your R&D is in India, or if you go to market in Israel, or if you have some BD folks in Singapore, that's all good. We just need the CEO and the market eventually to be US and Canada. A couple of companies we have invested in include computer vision for colon cancer, machine learning to detect biomarkers to develop antibodies, cloud platform for robotics, and so on and so on. TauVentures.com has our entire portfolio. And without further ado, let me pass over here for our panelists to introduce themselves briefly. Everybody's bio is in more detail in the materials that everybody has, but let's give a little bit more color here. And just to make this easy, I'll go alphabetical order. So Brian, I'll pass it to you first.
Sure, thanks, Amit. I'll say good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining from. This is Brian Legler, Principal at Touchdown Ventures. I can just start with maybe a little bit about Touchdown and how we're different, and as well as my focus in digital health. So at Touchdown, we're corporate VCs managing over 15 separate corporate venture funds across 9 industries. In total, over $1 billion currently under management. With about 50 portfolio companies across all these funds. We've got over 40 investment professionals on both coasts. And our corporate partners include a lot of household names like Kellogg or T-Mobile, Avery Dennison. On the healthcare side, we have an independent pediatric hospital system, as well as ColorCon Ventures. ColorCon Ventures is where I spend the majority of my time. ColorCon is the leading supplier of critical non-active ingredients to pharma. So things like specialty film coatings, controlled release additives, colors, inks. And we're probably most famous for putting an M on M&Ms or making Doritos orange. But we're primarily selling ingredients to 4,000 plus pharma manufacturers around the world. And we have a smaller business in food and nutrition. Our check size can vary from fund to fund. But it's usually sector specific and stage agnostic. And for ColorCon's initial check size, about 1 to 3 million, typically behind another strong traditional VC or CVC in some cases. And our interests in digital health are really B2B pharma tech, X therapeutics, which I'm happy to get in more detail later if we want on it, but I'll just, for sake of introductions, pass it to the next person.
Sure. Dana, all you. Oh, you're on mute, Dana.
That's never happened before. Thanks very much. I'll give just a very brief background. We've been doing private investing for about 35 years, have, I think, 9 funds, and we are investing from the very beginning with companies perhaps 1 to 2 million through a founder fund vehicle. Then we have a growth fund vehicle that is looking for companies with 3 to 20 million in revenue. And then we have a fund of funds that's investing in other funds that are pertinent to us, where we share deal flow and relationships as well as later stage capital. So we can invest very early all the way through quite late. In fact, we will invest just through the fund of funds just before IPO. But most of what we do is in that middle bucket of growth funds. Institutional investors from the US, Europe, and a little bit from Asia. We are very active in the sense of obviously being on boards and trying to help strategy. We like very much platform opportunities where we can merge and vertically integrate some of the services that our companies can add for their customers. We're probably best known for companies in the clinical trial area. We've done 35 plus years of clinical trial work. Parexel is the one that most people are aware of, but we did Ilex Oncology and a number of others around the space. Digital health for us is broadly defined all around the payer, provider, and pharma, and we'll invest in all of those categories. It's a team of 10 of us, and then we have 15 venture partners who are pharma and or provider or payer experienced.
Great. Michael, over to you.
Thank you, Amit. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Siedler. By training, I have a background as a molecular biologist, not the most typical background to start a venture capital fund. Nevertheless, I am a co-founding partner at Red Alpine. We started in 2007 and currently are raising our fund number 6. We have about 500 million assets under management. We invest in Europe with a focus on Germany and Switzerland. We are pretty sector agnostic, yet we have 2 classical strongholds. That's life science on the one side and classical tech on the other side. And the overlapping intersection between the 2 areas is digital health. And we are particularly interested in that space because that's where our 2 experiences really overlap, and we focus on B2B and B2C plays. Just today, as an example of a digital health investment, we have invested in a German company called Can Be Care, a tech startup that is disrupting with technology the home care market. With that, I hand over to the next speaker. Last
but not least, Nadav, all you.
Yeah, thanks, Amit, and a pleasure being here. Thanks for inviting me to speak. So, by way of introduction, my name is Nadav Shimoni. Just in a line about myself, I'm a physician by training, but actually coming from mechanical engineering. Before that, spent some time as an investor, went back to serve as a physician, and everything converged into this position where I lead digital health investment for Arkin Holdings. Arkin Holdings is essentially a family office evolved into a holding company currently managing about $1.5 billion across almost any sector in healthcare, pretty much the largest private money in healthcare in Israel. We partner only with institutional players in Israel throughout several funds, which we manage, and also the anchor investor. So pretty broad exposure, both in pharma, devices, and digital health, which is like the new kid in town for us. We started investing in digital health only a few months ago. We are pretty narrow, in our perspective on digital health, pretty focused to software only, so not doing like hybrid devices or wearables and so forth. Pretty flexible on our check size, but being more pragmatic, we focus on early stage investment, at least at this point, and we invest off our balance sheet. So the inherent flexibility of like a strategic type of family office investments.
Fantastic. So let me get started here for us, asking some pointed questions to subgroups of you, and then we'll ask questions to all of you, and then we'll open it up for the audience questions. So that's how we'll structure the rest of the panel. And Nadav, since I had you last, let me start with you, if I may. And then Michael, I'll move over to you. So Michael just raised the issue that he's a molecular biologist, not a typical background for a VC. And Nadav, you yourself are an MD. There's certainly pluses and minuses to having those kinds of backgrounds. And let me start with you, Nadav. Like doctors, I've invested in a few doctors myself. I'm a pretty big fan of doctors who are entrepreneurs, yet overall medicine is very much conservative in adopting innovation. And in fact, doctors very much resist, as not individuals, but as a culture, towards innovation. It's like, let's not see what could possibly cause benefits. Let's first and foremost make sure to minimize harm, right? It's a different lens. So I wanted to take your take on this. It's when do you invest in a doctor? When do you not invest in a doctor? And is the MD actually necessary to build a deeply technical company in healthcare?
Yeah, so great question, and reflect about that point a lot. So, I mean, first of all, first line in the Hippocratic Oath is first do no harm, right? So physicians have a tendency first not to break things, right? They want to keep things as they are and then to evolve. And perhaps for that reason, or that's maybe some of the reasons that, you know, innovating within healthcare is sometimes at least really hard. But I think, I mean, we really firm believers in multidisciplinary teams. And I think, you know, a clinical angle within a team could make a big difference. So for your, you know, off the bat, I won't invest just in an MD, one founder, as I won't invest in a single founder, I think, anyhow. But I think, you know, combining someone with a tech perspective and a business perspective and a clinical perspective makes a very like multilingual capability. And I think that's crucial. I mean, we see lots of, especially in Israel, lots of entrepreneurs which are really tech savvy, but they don't understand the nitty gritty of, you know, the clinical workflow. And it's really hard to tap in the workflow. You need to understand, you know, the dynamics. And having an MD on board can really make a difference in that perspective.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, an MD is a plus, but it's not a requirement. Is that fair on how you look at things?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, it really depends on the scenario. I think, you know, there are certain cases which you really want someone with, you know, the clinical knowledge and expertise on board, really fully involved. And in other cases, it could be, you know, a nice benefit. So, I mean, it really depends on the case.
Sure. I'm going to pick one last thing about this. Give me an example, perhaps from your portfolio or from a company that you've seen that is the contrapositive. They were not MDs, and yet they built an innovation that was very successful. At least in Silicon Valley, where I sit, there's a tendency for technologists to come and say, I'm going to disrupt healthcare. And then they run at 100 miles an hour and hit their head on a wall and fall flat, right? So given the contrapositive, when is it right for a group of technologists who are not as well versed in healthcare to build an innovation in healthcare?
Yeah, so I think in that case, we'll look for, you know, individuals with pretty straightforward experience in the domain they're trying to solve. Like, for example, we are almost closing an investment in a clinical trial company, like how to augment clinical trial from a certain perspective. And their team is not, you know, there is no one MD on their team, but altogether they have like 100 cumulative years working within CROs and, you know, relevant companies in this field. So we're really confident in their capabilities, you know, to disrupt, because they understand, again, the nitty gritty of their angle. So perhaps that could be a good example.
Copy. Michael, let me turn over to you as promised. So you, as a molecular biologist, come from a different DNA here, no pun intended, of being a scientist. So the same questions here is, when is it necessary for there to be a scientist in a team? What do you look for? And give me an example of perhaps a company in your portfolio or otherwise that was science heavy, yet did not have PhDs in the company. I'm basically trying to tease out for the audience to understand when and they should capitalize on their competitive differentiation, on their academic backgrounds, and when not to.
It's a super fine balance that you have to hit. You know, on the one side, if you do, and that particularly applies to biotech companies, for example, really deep tech in the end, you need PhDs that understand molecular biology and antibodies and the immune system and all of that. But if you just keep thinking like a scientist, it's going to be very difficult to build up a very successful company, because you have to be able to really also think outside the box and to go down paths that you believe are not feasible or not possible. And so therefore, it's really a fantastic mixture of deep scientific knowledge that you need in order to be successful. But then on the other hand, entrepreneurial vision that you have to have as well. And if the two elements keep each other in check in the same company, that can be very, very successful.
Right. So what I'm hearing from you is that scientists with a business mind, with a business sense, or at least scientists who partnered with folks who have a very strong business sense. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And not every scientist is a good entrepreneur, and not every entrepreneur is a good scientist. There are very few people who actually can combine both.
Fair. And let me ask you that question. And I know it's hard to say it in the abstract. So if you can give it maybe a specific example, could be from your portfolio, could be from outside, but how do you find that person who has the business sense and the science sense, or how do you diligence the fact that they have partnered well, like a PhD partnering with an MBA? Like, how do you diligence that that partnership is working well, or that this person doesn't need the partnership because they can do both things themselves?
You're getting right at the heart of the matter. We believe that our core investment criteria is really the team. It's the quality of the team. The team is a couple of people, not just one person. So the team needs to be well balanced. And it is like if you do an interview for a job, you have to have an assessment of the capabilities of the people, but also of the team as a whole. And by spending time with these people, you figure out, is this a well-balanced team that has several capabilities and is not just geared towards one side? And then, if you get that feeling and also the facts, then we feel comfortable to do an investment.
Copy. Well, let me turn it over to Brian and Dana. So I have a different set of questions for the two of you, which I joked about when we met last week. Is I was going to ask you, why the hell should I take your money? But let me explain a little bit more what I mean by that. So Brian, you work for Touchdown. Touchdown is a fantastic organization. You work with, I think, 40 corporates, if I'm not mistaken. At the same time, a lot of entrepreneurs have hesitations about taking money from corporates for good reasons. A corporate coming in too early at a seed stage, especially, could constrain your agenda, even if they don't officially or legally constrain it. And it could exclude you from working with other corporates. At the same time, a corporate gives you access to contracts and gives you access to, revenues. So I was wondering, how do you justify to an entrepreneur, how does Touchdown work, make sure to maximize the benefits and minimize the downsides of working with a corporate?
Thanks, Amit. Yeah, I agree that the reputation of corporate VC has been inconsistent. If you look back to the early 2010s, say a few years before Touchdown was founded, entrepreneurs and VCs might have welcomed corporates into about 25% of their deals. By 2019, it was close to half. That's according to Barron's last year. So, VCs and entrepreneurs, haven't stopped investing with corporates based on these some of these one-off experiences. I think, at least statistically, corporates have been further embraced. Now, everyone's situation is different, but in general, if I wanted to boost a round's chance of success, I'd want to include more mature sources of funding that could boost my startup's credibility and possibly revenues through a commercial deal, like you had mentioned. Now, certainly, as you know, there's some bad apples out there, but at Touchdown, our model of venture capital as a service for large corporations, which we really invented 6 years ago, is designed to be part of the solution. So what I mean by that is, well, I would suggest, first of all, checking out a blog post from our CEO, who is one of the founders of Comcast Ventures. It's called Top 5 Reasons Why Corporate Venture Programs Fail. And by reading that, you'll kind of understand, when you work with one of our funds, you know that we put in place proper executive alignment with good actors from the VC community on the teams that are responsive to entrepreneurs and reserved for future rounds. In most cases, if there's a closing, and if closing in 60 days from the time we take a first call is not fast enough, we'll simply encourage to do an initial close and give us an extra days needed on the back end with a second close. That's pretty commonly done in terms of working with corporates. And a lesser known but really powerful reason, I think, to involve corporates is actually, there's a lot of evidence out there about higher exit values. I've got actually a blog post last month called "Do Corporate VCs Boost IPOs?" And for the first time, we can really see, 20 years, the most recent 20 years of pitch book data on the topic that shows that consistently VC-backed IPOs with at least one CVC on the cap table were priced initially at IPO pricing at over 50% higher than those backed by VCs, traditional VCs alone. And this is really consistent across time periods. And also for the first time, we address questions, to your point, Amit, you talked about, seed, should we take them in at series seed or series, B, C? So for the first time, kind of data around that question, what is the optimal number of CVCs in the cap table? And also, what is the right time to bring your first CVC into the cap table?
Copy. And let me go a little bit deeper, if I may. So how do you control for the ups and downs of a corporate? And what I mean by that is, some people have joked that a corporate VC is only as good as the CEO who implemented it. The moment that CEO leaves, the corporate venture program gets scrapped. The successor usually gets rid of it. Or if the corporate has poor earnings, also gets scrapped. Or sometimes if it has good earnings, people internally within the corporate will argue, well, why are we spending money on venture? We should just be investing within the corporate itself. How do you control for all the ups and downs here of the corporate?
Yeah, and there's probably a few others that you haven't mentioned, like if there's a merger or, this big corporates, of course, acquire each other, and then there's a different agenda. But what you hit on first about, executive turnover, that's really probably the key reason why the average age of or lifespan of a corporate venture fund is only 3 to 4 years historically. Of course, with our involvement and that continuity that we provide, we try to extend that much, much further. And of course, there are plenty of examples out there, especially in pharma, of corporate venture funds that have been around 20 plus years. I think, how do you control for that? I think really the kinds of questions you can ask to a corporate if you're just starting to work with is just similar to like a VC fund. You might ask, is this your first fund? Is this something you've been doing for a while, and who exactly is involved in the effort? Is it at the C level? Is it just kind of one group within? And is there a team that's kind of dedicated around it that has VC experience that, if there was a major executive turnover, would that kind of scuttle that effort, or is it going to continue to move that ship forward? I think one interesting thing we saw that was kind of new about corporate venture this time is, when there's a recession, typically corporate venture will pull back and it's very cyclical. But during COVID, we did not see that effect. It actually stayed really strong. And of course, especially in life sciences where things kept being up and to the right. But I think across VC, they stayed strong. And so corporate venture is in its like 5th iteration at this point. And so it's matured quite a bit in the last, 30 years.
Great. Dana, I'm going to turn over to you now. You run the largest and most established of funds among all of us. And the question I have is similar that I had for Brian, except the angle here is, why should an entrepreneur raise from such a large fund, multi-stage fund, at an early stage? If I'm running a seed company, one of the concerns I might have is that there could be a signaling effect, meaning your firm, BMP, comes in, but then doesn't end up leading the Series A or the Series B. Or if you do end up leading the Series A or Series B, you're not going to negotiate against yourself. So you may not give the entrepreneur as high of a valuation as they might get. There's obviously pros and cons to getting a multi-stage fund to lead too early, but I was wondering, how do you guys see it at BMP?
Well, you raised a whole lot of good questions here. I think the corporate one is really an important one to discuss, and maybe we'll do it later. But I have a more skeptical perspective, by the way, on the corporate world, and I can discuss that later and try to give you an answer on the front end, which is where we're heading now is in my opinion. We're in the money business with so much capital out there. Interest rates have been going down for 30 years. Institutional investors, endowments, foundations need to have better returns. So there's a huge amount of capital in the marketplace. And I would argue that we're in the business here, and I think all of us are in the business of building businesses. And building businesses is different than trying to, maximize the price of a deal. I have learned very well that by holding companies and paying higher prices for lower risk and building companies over the longer run, you create wealth. You can create nice IRRs with short-term returns, but you're going to create wealth, billion-dollar, multi-true billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar companies by really living the company and understanding your responsibilities as a director. And I'll link this a little bit. At no time in my career have I seen the confusion of the role of a venture investor and a corporate investor and an entrepreneur having so many different subtleties of responsibility. We are directors, and directors, we are first responsible to the company, but it's very difficult when a 100,000 employee or even more employee company steps in as an investor into some of these companies to remember it's your job to help that company succeed. It's in the bylaws, it's in the charters. But what is happening is corporate has, and I would agree with Brian, that the corporate world has become very sophisticated. We have not, and I've worked with the corporate investors for 30 plus years. And what we have found is that when it comes down to certain decision making, the public stock price and the strategic issues on the intellectual property really revert back to the corporate responsibility. And I will say that we've had these conversations with the corporates, and they admit that they're in a conflicted stage. It's the same thing for a venture investor. If you're a venture investor trying to make money and you're thinking of your partnership first, you're probably not going to make so much money. And so that's sort of one point. In terms of the multi-stage vehicle, I will say that the strategy evolved over the last 5 to 6, well, probably even longer than that now, because partially we wanted to invest in only things we knew and get a good relationship with the entrepreneur and be totally committed to that entrepreneur. So we don't invest in competitive companies. We invest in macro sectors. And again, the clinical trial world is where we're best known for all these periods of time. I will say that your question on the doctor investing was fascinating. You can look up Harvard Business School has a case on this actually from 20 plus years ago about why you shouldn't invest with a doctor as a CEO. Now, of course, that's evolved quite a bit. But I think Brian and all the team here have said that if you bring the right team together, it's not whether it's the doctor, it's the skill sets. We would never have invested in the HBS graduate, Joe von Rickenbach in PowerXL, had he not had his expertise in the regulatory affairs area with Ann Sayeg. So the team balanced itself out. And corporate stepped up there very aggressively, but we didn't put them on the board. We took some capital. Let me do the last point here on CardioMEMS. CardioMEMS was a story which is an implantable into the pulmonary artery for congestive heart failure. We made a decision with a doctor as the CEO out of Cleveland Clinic to bring in strategics and corporates to the investment. We did not have them, however, be anything other than observers, and we brought 3 at the same time. And so by having 3 at the same time and being very careful about the information, we were able to maximize the exit alternatives and really get value added out of the corporates. What we get sensitive is that when there's one corporate that stands up, suggests that there's going to be a commercial deal that will happen, but not very often for us have we seen that commercial deal take place. We do, however, see a high price on the round take place. So that sort of links all 3 of your points today, which really do all go together.
Great. Well, Brian, I do want to give you an opportunity also. Dana had some pushback here on the corporate side. And by the way, I have worked for a corporate VC myself, so I have firsthand experience of this. So I wanted to make sure if there was other points that you wanted to make. And I'll trigger that by asking a very pointed question, which is, should a corporate VC ever lead a round?
Well, they certainly do lead rounds. I mean, we have, I think it's less common in the touchdown portfolio to have a corporate lead a round, but we do have some that do. It's a tough question, should they lead a round? I think, you have to probably go through, at least have people on the, if you have people on the team that have venture experience and how to lead a round, then that you can be capable to lead a round. But if it's kind of a first time out, just dipping your toe into venture to start leading rounds, we would never really advise that. You kind of have to kind of get to know that venture community and what it's like and what it involves, just to be a good co-investor, right? Learn to walk or learn to crawl before you can walk. I would just add on to Dana's last point, and I think obviously, Dana, I know you, I really respect your experience with corporates and all the way through Parexel, of course, which we see in our space a lot, the CROs. In terms of, look, I mean, you're talking about commercial agreements can get delayed for corporates for so many different reasons. So one thing we do as a best practice is to de-link the two decisions. So one of the worst things that can happen on a deal is for a corporate to say they're going to make an investment that everyone's relying on to be there for at the end of the day, and then link it with a commercial agreement, and then the commercial team says, we're not ready, we can't operate on this timeline. And so the deal falls through. Either that, or they're somehow using it as like a stick in a negotiation, like you do this deal or you don't get this commercial deal. That's also just gets you a reputation for being a bad actor, and then you're never going to get into some of the best deals. So we've kind of said, okay, we understand this is what you could do. This is really the best way to do things. De-link the two. Don't use it as a stick. And you can say we want to do a commercial deal in the future, but we're going to do an investment now or not. And then we're going to look at this commercial agreement later, and they're going to be evaluated by a totally separate team, which is not mixed in with those fiduciary duties that Dana was mentioning.
I agree with that.
Let me switch gears here so we can do more content. And I want to encourage Michael and Nadav especially to pick up this question. But by all means, all of you feel free to pick it up. What I've noticed in my investment career is that there is a gap in early stage digital health, and you pay a price for it. Either you pay between the seed and the Series A, or typically in the Series A, you can't get to the Series B and you do a Series A extension. And this gap comes from the fact that there's long sales cycles. Providers and payers take 9 to 18 months to give you a contract. You just simply can't get to that revenue target to be able to raise the next milestone. Sometimes it's because of FDA approval. It takes forever. And sometimes it's simply because the execution, right? That's not perhaps systemic, that's perhaps based on individual companies. But bottom line, the vast majority of companies in digital health that I've invested have had to do extensions, as opposed to non-digital health companies, which rarely have to do extensions. I wanted to ask all of you, but starting perhaps with Michael and Nadav, is that assessment perhaps just my experience? Has that been yours also? Are there mitigants here for entrepreneurs to be able to avoid having to do the extension? Or should we not care? Is this how digital health is done? And yes, embrace the extension. That's the way it is, and that's the way it should be. You'll pay up for dilution, but it is the way to build a digital health company. So passing to you guys.
Michael, do you want to start?
I guess your observation is quite right. I would say, though, that there are digital health companies that are really more leaning towards a tech product with less regulation and also less payer risk. And there you tend to have less of these extensions. And if you have companies or products that are really heavily regulated, then of course you're at the mercy of the regulatory bodies and also the reimbursement codes and so on, and that may lead to these kind of extensions. I think if you're a smart investor, you can exploit that.
So I will actually take that from another angle. So Israel is considered like the startup nation. We want to be entrepreneurs here. Every cafe you walks in, where cafes are open, obviously you see someone with a laptop and someone sitting across him. So either he's pitching or he's recruiting. That's every other cafe. And I think digital health is kind of interesting because I'm an alumni of a very high tech IDF unit, the Israeli army, and lots of alumni are very, tech savvy individuals. And I got, on almost on a weekly basis, a phone call of, yeah, I sold a cyber company, I had a data company, and now I see that, you know, digital health is a combination of meaning and you know, an opportunity to do something quite rapidly, as opposed perhaps medical devices or pharma. And I think it's a misconception. I think, you know, no matter how you approach it, healthcare takes time, because, you know, it essentially builds on trust, and it takes time to build trust. I think, I mean, when you're doing something which is less regulated, you will still need to, you know, fit in the workflow and convince, I don't know, the IT department to rely on you, and so forth. And of course, when you have to face, you know, the FDA, and not to mention, you know, CMS or other, you know, reimbursement issues, those things takes time. And I think no matter how you approach it, digital health will take as long as devices, give or take, you know. So it's a similar ball game, and, you know, same expectations on time length. I think, you know, there are much broader opportunities, but that's, you know, a different conversation. But in terms of like capital expectations and, you know, durations, we're coming, you know, with the full understanding it will take time and money, of course, as a byproduct.
So let me take the points you both made. At the end of the day, what I heard from both Michael and you, Nadav, is that this is intrinsic almost to digital health, taking more time, doing more stage financing, doing more extensions. Dana, let me turn it over to you. You've been investing for
A long
35 plus years, right? So have you seen this change? Is this going to change? And let me give very specific examples. Just last week, we had Cityblock raise at $1 billion. We had Clover go public at 8 billion, if I'm not mistaken. And we had a couple of other unicorns show up. And in fact, there has been, some people call it mezzanine capital, some call it staying private longer, but lots and lots of capital being thrown into companies, perhaps pioneered by Uber, perhaps pioneered by Airbnb. But that same phenomenon seems to be happening here for digital health. There's lots more money available. In fact, I just saw a report last week on Friday that the amount of money that went into digital health in 2020 is off the charts. Not just in terms of natural growth, but literally 2020, for various reasons, got a lot more money. So is this going to change? Or is this, no, this is just a blip? It's always going to take longer in digital health.
Well, look, I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned out of COVID and what has happened here. It's extraordinary to see these vaccines get done so quickly. And what you're seeing is that much of the problem is not the technology itself. And by the way, the science for the vaccine has been going on for 15 and 20 years. So one of the fundamental things that has happened is it became such a crisis that many of the bureaucratic issues got overrun. And so I'm quite surprised at how fast that happened. Time is human nature. Digital healthcare has always been digital for as long as I've been investing. It just happens to have this new moniker of what it is. And I think the question is human behavior and what the market is doing. The market wants more transparency, but our entire system of healthcare, certainly in the US, does not lead toward transparency. It leads toward electronic health records controlling private networks. It leads to the payer system controlling their private networks. So I think we're going to see some changes going forward with the new administration here on some of these issues. That doesn't mean I want to see more regulation, but what they're talking about today, yesterday, literally, as we speak, is breaking a clinical trial data set and releasing the data and breaking it into 2 treatments, which the FDA has not yet approved. And it's being done because it has to. So I guess I would say that the digital health topic and the valuation topic are in a disconnect. The fact that there's so much capital out there. Now, there has been a 50% reduction in the number of public companies in the marketplace. And so therefore, it's been very difficult to get adequate money to work for the institutions that are needing 6, 7, 8% for sure returns for their pension fund structures. So I think I'm always and have been skeptical of the term unicorn. And so I think that people are getting in front of themselves on making money and returns. But I will say that the discounted cash flow models are now going out further than I have ever seen to try to justify valuations. So I'm arguing for our entrepreneurs to go step by step and work through the journey, and don't let the financial strategy get in front of the business strategy. And again, this is a thematic top-down approach. So I'm skeptical about valuations. We are missing deals now in a competitive manner, not by 10% or so is what it used to be. We're missing deals by 50 to 100% differential on valuations. And I'll end with a story here. I had a conversation on two companies in the clinical trial space for virtual trials, for distributed trials. And by the way, distributed trials are coming. They're just a part of the trial process, part of accrual, part of compliance. But I had this conversation with the fund that was $1 billion fund that bid 2x what we bid for this company. That was a $3 million company. I won't tell you the number was bid. And I asked him how he got there. It was a West Coast fund. And I said, how did you get to this model? And how did you do value evaluation? And he said, you know what, it really doesn't matter what the valuation is now. It's going to be a big company. And so therefore, if I pay the wrong number. So I'm hearing that. I've heard that 3 or 4 times in the last couple of few months. And I lived through the bubble period where we had a fund that was worth 5 times its money for 5 months and 2 weeks. And then in 2 weeks, as the lockup broke on these companies, it wasn't. So I'm just saying, you know, take your time and be patient. And when you know the price is too high, it's probably too high.
Well, Dana, well said. I tell my own entrepreneurs that raising too much money at too high of a valuation is as bad of a problem as raising too little, because it fundamentally sets the bar too high for your next round. It changes the culture of the company. You're not as cash conscious. At the same time, let me flip over. I have been an entrepreneur myself, and I did raise funding, and I think many of you have been operators in the past. Why shouldn't I, as an entrepreneur? Like, why shouldn't I? If the market is giving me money, why shouldn't I take it? And I will try to time myself with the market and try to get an exit before it collapses, right? It's basically taking advantage of maybe we're living through a bubble. So I'm opening this up for all of you. It's how do you control that very natural impulse that entrepreneurs will have to say, well, I'm getting the money, I should take it?
Yeah, I don't know if I have an answer, but I can say that I've observed several times this year, especially in the digital clinical trials area, which has been extremely hot since COVID started getting going. It originally was, 2/3 of clinical trials were shut down. But then once they figured out that digital clinical trial solutions were a solution to that problem, and it really pulled demand forward another 2 to 3 years, saw rounds that started out as at $10 million rounds end up being oversubscribed, and say, okay, now we're going to raise 30. Well, maybe now we're going to raise 50. And so that's a huge difference from your business only needs 10 million to maybe even break even forever to, we're just going to go ahead and raise 5 times that amount. And I don't know, I guess I'd throw it over to the others on the panel for, potential solutions to that, or how you talk someone down from something like that.
What I have experienced in that respect is that more experienced founders tend to be more realistic. They know that if they don't get the equity story right, through all the rounds, that they have to pay the price later. So I have figured out or seen that less experienced rookie founders, they take all the money they can, they maximize the valuations, but they don't think about tomorrow. And that more experienced founders know that something's going to happen if they take too much money right now.
So, Michael, let me give you a pushback here. What if it's your own portfolio company? Your own portfolio company comes, hey, Michael, so-and-so is giving me a term sheet. They're giving me, it'll be a 4x for you in the next round. How do you control for your own incentive there to get that up round, or perhaps even a large exit?
Yeah,
I mean, exit all of us do, but
I agree. I mean, obviously it's deceptive, and you can definitely maybe it's justified, maybe it's not. The future will tell. And of course, yes, if it's a 4x or a very high valuation, then it's very tempting. But again, in the end, we try to look at the story of those companies, from the beginning to the exit. So we also try to keep the exit in mind. Where and how could that company be sold? Who is the buyer? Is it going to be an IPO? At what stage is that going to happen? And so we try to somehow see an equity story that makes sense, because we know that in the next round, somebody else is also going to look at this equity story. And if it's strange, it's going to be more cumbersome to raise the next round.
I want to take a pause here before continuing. Audience, please make sure to send us questions. We have 15 minutes till the end of the panel. The fact we haven't got questions here is either a sign of we're having a fantastically engaging conversation or a really bad sign. So I'm hoping it's the former, not the latter. And Michael, let me turn back to you while folks type up and send us questions. One thing that I tell my own portfolio companies is that, hey, raise enough for 18 months, ideally 24 months. If you have extra, take the extra and put it away and think of it as non-existent. Don't use it to run the company. Or perhaps if you do need extra, raise venture debt rather than just raising equity. Do you use any of these metrics? Is Europe different than what we do here in Silicon Valley?
I think it's surprisingly similar. And the main difference is that our ecosystem is less advanced and that we're behind a couple of years. But the mechanics is surprisingly similar. And what we try to do is we try to have the portfolio companies to raise enough money to achieve the next meaningful value inflection point. And typically that's 12 to 18 months out. That's what we try to do.
Well, what about you, Nadav? Israel is, as you pointed out, startup nation. It is the most startup country of any country out there. Is it different for you, or do you also give guidance around metrics around fundraising for entrepreneurs?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, too much capital is bad, as you mentioned. I think, when crossing a certain point, people will find ways to spend out the capital, and you will have a very bad result in your next round and, overall in your company. So we are very sensitive, to define, the right milestone and inflection point, as Michael mentioned, and how really can you create, value with the right amount of money, and bring you in the right position to your next fundraising or perhaps a liquidation event. So for sure, that's a very sensitive point. And I will say another thing. I mean, for us to be a very reputable investor, we see companies approach us kind of like, validate their validation, because like having us on board will give like a sense of, of approval to this, high validation and evaluation, sorry. And we are very cautious. I mean, we're not magicians. Nobody is a magician. And, inflating a value from, I don't know, X to 100X or even 10X within a year, that's, I don't know, that's kind of magic. So we're not magicians. Perhaps there are other funds who are able to do that. And we don't want to take the risk because sometimes it can succeed, raise another round and so forth. But I think just one time that you fall in this, trap, you will get a very bad reputation. So we are very cautious about that, and I fully agree with Dana that rather pass and be patient rather than jump on a very weird story.
So there's some questions there that are coming up.
That's right. So I wanted to turn the first question from Gonzalo Ares. What signs do you look for early to assess the balance between science and entrepreneurial expertise of the team for any one of you?
Well, I'll answer that in terms of the process of a clinical trial. Years ago, people said there's no way that the pharma companies and biotechs would outsource their data and their information. Well, it was pretty clear that by having a specialized outsourcing approach, you could do it faster. But one of the issues that's challenging, and we've found it not just in that area, but all across, is when you take different skill sets of people and you put them all together and try to have them communicate. When you take some AI technology type people and put them in a room with someone who's learning, who's doing microbiology and or some sort of research in a lab, it's the seams and the seamlessness of the communication that's important. And I guess one of the things we have not talked about that much here, and that is the organization chart itself and how you augment and replace management team members as the companies grow faster than individual skill sets. And I do think that's where the venture community can really help out is crafting that org chart that creates value, not just the team that stays static. And I will say that the CEOs that we have worked with that have been the most successful and built the best companies in the long run are those who could understand the rules of sixes and nines. And the rules of sixes and nines was put out by John Cullinane, a very successful entrepreneur, software entrepreneur. And it's basically whenever you can augment your team and replace a 6 with a 9, you have made a huge organizational improvement. And that's because a 6 can't hire a 9. A 6 can hire a 5, with 10 being high. So I guess I would argue that in all, whether it's scientific or whether it's business or other areas, think of what it means to do 6s and 9s. And it's really hard for a CEO who's been a founder CEO to change out someone he's been a partner with who now is a 6, but when got started was stronger. I hope you understand my organization chart commitment, because organization chart and governance leads to strategy. And the strategic decisions that you make are more important, in my opinion, and understanding the marketplace than some of the other details.
Let me move on to the next question so we give opportunity to everyone here. So Steven Zimmer is asking all the panelists, where does AI drug discovery fit here, particularly when it's tending towards deep tech rather than biotech?
What is the question getting at, Stephen, about where does it fit in? I mean, we have one of these companies in our portfolio. We think it. I mean, I think it basically, yeah, it crosses over in both sides. We definitely see it as a pharma company in terms of developing drugs, but of course, that deep tech expertise is the team. You know, what pharma
Brian,
really doesn't.
I will let Stephen clarify the question a little further, but my interpretation is it's becoming increasingly in silico, right, on the computer. We actually have a company called Totient with Dana that does mostly identifying biomarkers. 80% of the work is on the computer, 20% is in the wet lab. So are you still looking at companies like that as a pharma company, or are you looking at them as primarily software companies that happen to have some pharma applications?
Well, I think similar to drug delivery companies, what these guys have figured out for AI for drug discovery is, if you're just a services company, you're never going to maximize the value of your company. And so they tend to go towards doing pipelines. That's what Schrodinger has done. They've taken a SaaS platform now that they've gone. This is the hottest IPO, not just in their sector, but in any sector for the last 12, 18 months. Relay came out, and so others are now shifting towards having their own drug pipelines. And pharma has been skeptical, of course, because they do things their own way. And then they see, okay, you want to prove to me that this works, do it with your own drug first. And so there's so much feedback saying, that's pushing these guys to have their own pipelines. Yeah, I see Nadav, as you're nodding your head. Do you want to add anything here?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, we have about $1 billion just in pharma. And our folks are, investing for about 2 decades in pharma, and they've seen so many, stories and, hypes. And I think there are lots of hype around AI drug discovery. Because essentially, as you said, I mean, trying to provide just services, there's a very thick ceiling for that. And as you mentioned, I think if you're so good, try to develop it yourself and prove you can. And once you do that, the sky's the limit, right? But, most people shy away because they look for, I don't know, perhaps, a faster route. And again, it, converge with the question about, timelines Amit asked before.
Great. I want to make sure we take the last question we have here, and maybe we have room for one more question from Trevor Rajgoat. He's asking whether for seed stage B2B digital health AI companies, what factors other than management do we believe distinguish category leaders and companies that will invest in?
I'll make one comment and then be quiet and let everyone answer. What we're finding is that many entrepreneurs do not appreciate the market itself. And the power of the market is much more powerful for an impact of change than any one granular company's indication. Clearly, a IP or a new molecule would be different, and a few other things might be a little bit different. But there's a time when the market is ready for change. COVID is a time where the market's ready for change. Entrepreneurs need to understand, in our opinion, the FDA, they need to understand CMS, and also the political nature of the environment that they're working in. And so I would say that the differentiation for those leaders who are successful is that they have a very good understanding of the competitive landscape, but also on where the broader markets are moving, and they prepare themselves there. We were 10 years ahead of the clinical trial market when we invested. And usually if you're going to build a big company and you don't want to pay the price, you've got to be at least 5 years ahead. So I would say it's the management team leadership. And then I'll also say it is informed and rational passion. There's passion that is not well placed because someone's committed to an idea and to build a business. And then there's the passion that fully appreciates the bigger good. And that's why I would say that if you're focused on building a business and financing is simply one part of the resources, the people are more important. So that's sort of my take on the broader market.
Brian, Michael, Nadav, would you like anyone pick up from where Dana left us?
Yes, something that we would look at in a seed stage B2B digital health company, obviously, besides the team, is something I call third-party validation. So basically, is there anyone outside the company confirming that what the company does is really valuable, is ready to engage in an engagement that eventually will cost some money? So essentially, in an early stage that confirm that what the company does is really valuable.
Perhaps I'll add something which kind of resonate with what Dana said. I think, early stage investments are really focused around, a real problem. It kind of resonate, with understanding the landscape around this problem, as Dana mentioned, but you see just too many companies with a solution, with a technology trying to find a problem. So we are very, very keen to understand the problem and to feel it. And unless we are very convinced with the problem, we won't proceed.
Well, I'll add my own spin to this. I'll take the privileges of moderator here for a second. UCSF came out with a report recently showing the adoption of telehealth pre-COVID, 2%. Adoption post-COVID in 6 weeks, 40%. So to Dana's point, COVID is an accelerant. It took secular trends, and have accelerated them and broken a lot of paradigms. We at Tau Ventures don't invest in COVID companies, but we are very mindful that COVID has created a big disruption. And to Michael's point, having proof points, having customers, having pilots, that's pretty key, especially at a seed stage. That's a message I'll leave here for all seed stage or aspiring entrepreneurs, is that an idea is great. Having proof points makes it real. Nadav and Brian, I wanted to thank you, Michael and Dana also, for joining us today. Thank you to all the folks listening in. We had 45 folks. Life Science Nations, thank you very much. Look forward to seeing all of you in the rest of the conference.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your participating, and a big thank you to the panelists for taking part as well. And I'm sure that the panelists would be more than happy to answer any more questions if you reach out to them through the partnering profile or the partnering platform. So thank you all very much, and have a great rest of the conference.
See you later.
Thanks, Amit.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.